And while Ed was talking, as if by magic, we've been joined by Labour's Shadow Women and Equalities Secretary, Daw Butler. Very good morning to you two. Let us start, given that we are in London, you're a London MP with events of the past couple of days. Events in and around Parsons Green, the fifth successful terror attack that we've seen in the UK just this year. Is this the new normal? Is this what people who live in your constituency will simply have to deal with from now until some unknown point in the future?
No, I think Cressida Dick said it quite succinctly today when she said that we shouldn't think that this is the norm, but we do need to be more vigilant as we go about our daily lives and our daily jobs. So we should continue as normal, and we just should be more vigilant. And it is shocking what's happening. It's shocking that we've had 5 attacks, but we also have to give credit to our police officers and our public servants who's also stopped a lot of attacks from happening. And I think we need to really give due credit to those police officers and ensure that, you know, they know that they're appreciated.
You mentioned the police there. Of course, they came from both the Met and British Transport in this particular instance. Announced this week, they are going to be getting a pay rise, a cause for celebration amidst all the bad news that we've become so used to.
Well, it's not actually a pay rise in terms of it's less than inflation. So 1.75% is less than 2.9% inflation. So essentially, it's still a cut. And for 7 years, they've not had a pay rise. And we heard just last week that some of them were feeling quite despondent and down. And when you think about the work that they're doing, we need to make sure that we keep their spirits up because they're keeping us safe. And I think that's the most important thing, that we have to not just say that we appreciate them, but our actions needs to reflect that as well.
So based on that, we can assume that Labour is committing to above-inflation pay rises?
Labour is committed to scrapping the cap. We've said it, we've had it in our manifesto. It's not a new policy, it's a policy that's there and fully costed, and we've said it in our manifesto, and that's what if we were in government, that's what we would do. And I think the important thing is that Labour is a government in waiting. We're not yet in government. So all we can do is analyse the situation that we know, give a statement of intent to what a Labour government would look like and what a Labour government will feel like. And that's what we did. That's what we did for the general election in our manifesto.
You're attacking the government for, in effect, not going above that inflation rate, for delivering, you know, in real terms, a pay cut. So it's not an unfair assumption to think that the Labour Party would do something different. So, I mean,
you're quite right. We'll do something different.
But how much
the country wouldn't be in the state it is.
How much money have you actually committed to dealing with the issue of public sector pay then?
Well, as I said, the Labour Party, we are the government in waiting. So what we can do is say, this is what a Labour government will look like. This is what you can be guaranteed under a Labour government. That's our statement of intent as a government in waiting. So we've committed the £4 billion to ensuring that we would scrap the cap. It's been fact-checked time and time again. Everybody's fact-checked the figures, and the figures stand up. And I think the important thing is to sort of establish why is it that our government treats public servant workers the way that they do.
But £4 billion isn't enough to give the public sector an above inflation pay rise, though, is it?
Right. But we're not talking about above inflation pay rise.
You're criticising the government for not giving police officers an above inflation pay rise.
What they could do is they could give public sector workers and inflation pay rise. That's what they could do now if they had the political will to do it, and they're choosing not to do it. And that's the issue here. That's the problem here. The problem is that you say that you appreciate public sector workers, but really when it comes down to it, you don't deliver on what you're talking about. And that's what this government's
But aren't you both saying exactly the same thing? You're slightly divergent in terms of the figures, but you're saying it's bad that the government is, in essence, forcing a pay cut upon the public sector. But on your own figures, £4 billion a year wouldn't be enough for you to do anything other than offer them a real terms pay cut.
Look, £4 billion is enough to make sure that public sector workers, and remember, as I keep reiterating, we are a government in waiting. We're not the government. When we've got the books in front of us, we'll be able to then decipher what else we'd be able to deliver for public sector workers. But we need to see the figures and the books. But at the moment, we're not in government. We are the government in waiting.
So you're just guessing then, aren't you? Look, I mean, the IFS says that if you want to give a real terms pay rise to the public sector, it would be £7 billion a year minimum. So you don't have the money to do it, and you're shouting at the government because they don't have the money to do it.
No, I'm not shouting at the government. What I'm saying to the government is, you've got all this rhetoric in terms of what you're saying, but when it comes to delivering, you're not delivering at all for public sector workers. And public sector workers deserve better, and they deserve to be respected, and they deserve not to have a pay cut that they've had for the last 7 years, to be 20% worse off than they were in 2010. Our public sector workers deserve more than that.
I have to say, I'm not entirely clear on your plans there. You're criticising the government because they're not giving them an above-inflation pay rise. Your own plans don't give them an above-inflation pay rise. Look, I mean, that's one area of policy in which there's considerable doubt, considerable confusion.
I don't think there's any confusion.
I think there's quite a bit of confusion.
I think I've been quite clear.
I mean, what is your party's Brexit policy at the moment? I've been trying for a couple of weeks now to get to grips with it. It's pretty confusing, isn't it?
OK, so I don't see what's confusing. I think that we've been quite consistent in terms of what our policy is. There's certain things, if you like, that are in concrete. And that is that what Labour Party wants to do is have a jobs-first Brexit. We want a Brexit that is built on jobs, built on skills, and built on infrastructure, what's good for the country. That hasn't changed at all in Labour Party's policy.
OK, I'll explain exactly why I'm confused. I mean, essentially, the fundamental dividing line, as we see it, between a hard and a soft Brexit is the issue of the single market. So, back in July, we had Jeremy Corbyn asked if he could be categorical about whether or not we would be in the single market, we would leave the single market under a Labour government. He said yes. A month later, you had the Deputy Leader, Tom Watson, saying this, we think that being part of the single market is important in those transitional times, and it might be a permanent outcome. Last Sunday, on this very show, I asked your colleague, John Ashworth, I put that quote to him and I said, is that the right? No, I don't think that is the case. And then, I hope you're keeping up with all of this, because it keeps shifting. The very next day, Jeremy Corbyn came out, contradicted him again. We want a relationship which allows us to trade within the single market, whether that's formal membership is open to discussion. Chessington World of Adventures has nothing on the Labour Party when it comes to roller coaster rides.
That's a good line.
Well, explain the policy, because I honestly don't understand.
The policy is really quite clear. There needs to be...
OK, single market. Are we going to be in or are we going to be out?
So, well, we'll be in during the transitional arrangements. There needs to be a transitional arrangement. So, there's all this talk about the cliff edge, that we are running towards this cliff edge. And I tell you what, the Tories are making such a mess of these negotiations that we're having to clarify all the time what our position as a country should be. And Theresa May is doing a speech this week, OK? And we need to be clear when she does that speech.
And we'll be discussing that a lot in
terms of what our transitional arrangements will be.
Clear this up then. Are we going to be in the single market after that transitional period? Is there any possibility of us being in the single market after that transitional period?
A transitional period means that we will be in the single market for as short a time as possible.
And then?
But for as long as necessary. Because what we don't want to see is our economy fall off that cliff edge because of the uncertainty to businesses. So
I'm going to have to ask the question one more time. Are we going to be in the single market after the transitional period?
No,
yes or no?
It's a transitional period. So we will be in the single market during the transitional period. That is the Labour policy. And that is because we want to avoid a cliff edge, which businesses have said we need to avoid in order to ensure that our economy grows and doesn't fall and stagnate. We've seen businesses that are saying are not investing in skills or infrastructure because of the uncertainty over Brexit. So we have to be clear as the government in waiting. Remember, we're not the government. We are the government in waiting. This is our statement of intent.
We may well be asking for greater clarity during the week. But for now, Daw Butler, thank you very much indeed.